Welcome to CareTalk, America's home for incisive debate on healthcare business and politics. I'm John Driscoll, the chairman of the Yukon Health System, and today we have my old friend Lekan Wang, partner at JSL, an AI-first healthcare investment fund that is joining with some of the cutting-edge companies that are leveraging technology in advancing healthcare and hopefully creating better outcomes at lower costs. Lekan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John, for having me.
Lekan, maybe we'll start with, since everybody claims to be an AI expert today, you actually have some experience in AI before this AI moment. Maybe tell us a little bit about your own background and how you got interested and involved in technology in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I grew up in Minnesota, where, actually a few blocks away from Optum headquarters. And from a young age, I was hearing about all these people in Silicon Valley and got super interested. So ended up at Stanford, went there for a couple of years. And when I graduated, a single genomic sequence I think it had just fallen under $1 million a piece. And I was super interested in genomics. Even thought about doing a PhD for a little bit of time, but ended up graduating into the recession and joined this little startup called Palantir Technologies at the time. When I joined, I was mostly doing some intel and defense work. But before I knew it, I had a kind of healthcare opportunity there. And with a couple of people, started delving into healthcare. So
maybe slow down there to describe who Palantir is. And they're a mega tech company now. But how did it start? And maybe what's the backstory about maybe Alex Karp and Palantir to kind of give folks a sense of how novel it was at the time.
Yeah, I mean, the founders of Palantir can definitely give you the cleaner version of that story. But I think at the time, the contrarian view of Palantir was that it could actually integrate lots of disparate pieces of data together. Palantir was built from kind of the ashes of 9/11, when a lot of our intelligence and defense data was not well integrated. And that partially allowed 9/11 to happen. So the theory was that if we could, integrate some of that data, but still really respect, civil liberties, security rules, and all of that, we could actually kind of get the best of both worlds, which is that you could actually use data more effectively while still preserving privacy and civil liberties. And I think in healthcare, when we first started, there were a couple of use cases we were working on. One of them was actually working with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, on foodborne epidemiology. And one of the, I think, interesting things about foodborne epidemiology, especially with the CDC, is that a lot of, foodborne investigations are actually done at the state and county levels. But the CDC kind of has a coordinating function. So as you're investigating one of these large foodborne outbreaks, it's actually quite tough to, preserve the data integrity from each one of these counties and states, integrate it together. But, sometimes you can ask a certain question or you can't ask a certain question. Sometimes you can see a certain field of data and you can't. That actually becomes a somewhat challenging technical issue. So that ended up becoming one of the first problems that we worked on. And then I think since then, I think Palantir these days, a lot of people, really think of them as this, defense intel company. But I haven't been there in many years, but I believe the majority of its business is outside of intel and defense. And in healthcare, the problem it's solving, it's quite an unsexy one, but one I still really believe in, which is just how do you really integrate a lot of disparate data and really make it useful for the people in the front lines who are using it.
And obviously that is what a lot of the heavy metal in machine learning, machine language work early on and deep database work. But then what's that transition into artificial intelligence? When did that sort of become a thing? Because initially in Palantir's defense work and also the work with the CDC and also, frankly, during COVID, pulling together different disparate forms of data that needed to be tied together but were different in their native state and needed to be kind of analyzed at some level in order to be normalized and then draw insights from. When does that go from just large databases and kind of classic kind of regression analysis and being turned into these sort of automated loops that are now what we all sort of bond together and call artificial intelligence?
Yeah, you're totally right. I think when Palantir was founded in kind of the early 2000s, it was definitely the era of, I would say, kind of the era of AI before the current era, right? So just to give you some dots on the timeline. In 2024, DARPA threw the DARPA Grand Challenge, which was, the first time they tried to get automated cars to essentially drive through a desert,
Yeah, people
compared to what
don't
cars are
realize
doing
that the
today.
Defense Department was the first automated car investor.
Yeah, the Defense Department has a very close tie with the Valley and AI and everything that happens today. Of course, all people have conspiracy theories about that, but I mean, the DARPA and the Valley and technology innovation has always had a very close relationship. But yeah, it was in 2004 that DARPA threw its first grand challenge. And I think in that first grand challenge, it was like no car made it past like 15 minutes or some super short distance, right? The crazy thing, a year and a half later, in I believe fall of 2005, DARPA threw kind of a reprise of the DARPA Grand Challenge, and at that time, a couple of cars made it to the end of this very long drive through the desert. What's even crazier is just 2 years later, in the fall of 2007, DARPA threw the DARPA Urban Challenge, which is essentially a simulation of an urban course, and cars were able to do that. I do think between the DARPA challenges and in 2009 to 2012, this is kind of the onset of convolutional neural networks. It's essentially these much more complex, kind of deep neural networks that are just far larger than before, trained on this data set called ImageNet that Fei-Fei Li from Stanford created in order to train these large neural networks. The results of those two essentially swept in kind of the next era of AI, where people were saying, hey, it actually looks like we're actually able to do much more kind of real life scenarios with AI using very, very large amounts of data. Before that, we were using AI, but it was much more, I think you're right, it was much more statistical. That was the era of statistical AI, using what we today would probably call classical machine learning, using things like support vector machines and other types of methods to essentially classify one thing versus another, or use reinforcement learning, but using essentially more complex linear models.
I think what's interesting, Lekan, when you look back at AI, I mean, AI was a term that was coined in 1957. Where the Norbert Wiener kind of like don't even know.
Yeah, it was like the Dartmouth workshop, right?
The Dartmouth workshop, and the promise of that had been out for so long that people didn't really believe it. That when Fei-Fei Li and the ImageNet, and you could identify a cat or a dog, the output of it seemed sort of pedestrian to outsiders, but the insiders realized that the machines were starting to work and starting to actually create novel insights, and insights that hadn't been there before, off of much larger data sets. And the learning component, I think, is the thing that was sort of triggered. Okay, so so AI becomes relevant, 10-ish years ago. And also there's, which we don't need to get into, but the hardware really radically changes, and your ability to actually pull in more data to actually run the models. What's the relevance of those models and those machines to healthcare? Like, why is that? How do we think about, sort of stepping back, why AI and all of these machines and all this data matters in healthcare? Why is it relevant?
Yeah, I think so. First, going back to one thing that you said, how even back in the day we talked about AI, and I think one of the interesting things is, how do we even define AI, and what is AI, and what's good enough? And I think this is one of the things that it keeps changing, right? You can read papers back in the day that essentially says, we have these amazing washing machines now that can essentially run a load all by itself, and people honestly call that artificial intelligence, right? And if you think about, what we did before then, that did actually seem pretty intelligent and pretty amazing. In the 1950s, we also had, the system ELIZA, which is essentially, today you would call it probably like a very simple rules-based therapist chatbot, but literally it just, essentially asks you Socratic questions back, and people consider that AI. So the definition of AI really just keeps changing year over year, and especially today, I think from a monthly basis, probably it seems like the definition of what we consider AI actually changes. But to get back to your question, I think the current era of AI was really driven by three main things. Okay. So number one, and I think this is the biggest thing by far, is that we have a much greater availability of data of all kinds. Today's models are trained on an absolutely almost unimaginable amount of data. It's essentially a very large percentage of the entire internet, together with a lot of other synthetic data, together with armies of humans essentially also giving it essentially labels to train on. This is then driven by two things that make this possible. Number one is we have a much larger amount of compute available. So Moore's law has, you ask some people, it's sort of trailed off, but if you actually look at GPUs or graphical processing units, and these days we have, essentially tensor processing units or other types of specialty chips, specialty ASICs that are designed specifically for training neural networks. These are still getting, faster in an exponential rate. But a lot of this is also driven by this very specific model architecture called the transformer architecture. This was debuted in a paper that is very well known today in the industry called Attention is All You Need. Came out June of 2017. And what this essentially transformer architecture did is it took some of the older styles of neural networks that, honestly, we've known since the 50s and 60s. And it essentially augmented it in a few very key ways. One of the key ways is that instead of having to look at all of your previous weights in each iteration of training, it can essentially do it in kind of a much more scalable form by just multiplying matrices together. This is very simplified. Sorry for everyone who's technical. I'm super simplifying this, but it essentially allows this to be very scalable.
But simplifying this, there's a reach of data, and the internet plus the ability to build synthetic data or sort of create more data, plus humans, the data piece is there. It's really a three-part piece. The hardware is novel, much more powerful, and much faster. Then you take those two components and you add a different way of architecting the learning, the ability to drive, to answer questions, drive insights, and then that loops, because you're going back through the armies of humans, back through the data, running it through bigger and bigger hardware. And that attention is all you need basically was a better model or better architecture to build faster and more insightful models. And I think that's exactly that created the moment we're in right now. That's awesome. Why is it relevant to healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, in healthcare, as many may recall, like we've tried using what we call AI in healthcare many times, right? Anywhere from the expert systems to we use a lot of graphical models and Bayes nets during the statistical era. And each time, there's been aspects of AI that's been promising, but really, really underdelivered. And we also know that healthcare is an area that traditionally has been relatively slow to adopt technology. Today, I think we have a few big problems in healthcare. We have a surge in documentation and administration, and every clinician will tell you that they spend so much time doing documentation and administration. There's what I would think of as almost competitive documentation and administration between payers, providers, and other entities as well. And also, we have a huge access problem in healthcare too, right? I mean, I think for both you and me, we are in healthcare, and sometimes, I even have trouble understanding how to get the care I need and how to navigate my own care. So it's really, really challenging to get care. And I think with the current wave of AI in healthcare, for the first time, I've always been the person who's been in AI, who's been a little skeptical of actually AI applications in the real world. I'm actually, for the first time, actually extremely optimistic about how AI can actually affect these huge problems in healthcare, from decreasing administration to increasing access, to actually increasing the number of cures and treatments in healthcare as well. And this is actually being born in data too. This is not just, VCs, which I am one, investing in healthcare is hoping that this is going to come in 7 years. There's actually real clinical data, third-party validated data showing that in many of these areas, AI is really causing an improvement of these things. This is not to say that AI will cure everything; it'll make everything better. We actually have to be quite careful about how we approach this. But overall, I think now is a time to be very optimistic in the use of AI in healthcare.
So maybe give folks a little bit of a sense of what's going on at JSL and kind of what you're doing, what brings you to the point of investing and what kinds of things you're investing in.
So JSL Health Investment is a healthcare venture capital investment fund that started in around 2021, 2022. We invest only in healthcare companies that serve the US market and only healthcare companies that have some kind of technology, AI, software, data angle. And I think when we think about that, there's a couple of different areas. I mean, number one, we definitely invest in kind of AI first companies. And this is in both, healthcare and life sciences. I think maybe a good example of this would be a company called Symphony based in the Bay Area. They do medicinal chemistry. They essentially use AI to predict properties of certain chemicals. They predict the synthesis path of how you create these small molecules. And then they actually have robots that then you can, kind of just double click a button and a real drug will be printed out of the other side in both, tiny flow chemistry, nanomolar quantities, all the way up to gram quantities that you can actually administer. And this is, of course, a nice feedback loop. So I think a company like that is interesting from our perspective because, like I said before, a lot of AI is you're feeding a lot of data into these models. It's learning and then it's spitting stuff back out, right? A lot of people, this gets into a little bit of, the technical side again, but one of the big questions in AI these days is how well these models can actually generalize out of the training domain. And this is a very complex way to say, is the AI just repeating exactly what it's learned, or can actually kind of think for itself? The stochastic parrot, yeah. I sort of dislike that term, but that is kind of probably the short way.
Yeah, folks who the premise here, the pro AI is that there is learning and insight and novel things that are where a brilliant human would be or better. The stochastic parrot is it's just repeating back to us off of more data what humans already know. And so presumably you're not investing in parrots.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, well,
just for fair disclosure, I sit on the JSL board where Lekan and his partner sometimes listen to my questions, but presumably
we're a little stubborn sometimes.
Presumably, that is one of the interesting questions among folks who are sort of on the theoretical and the practical side, honestly, because whether it's just grabbing more information and getting to the answer faster, or actually creating novel insights, or both, is quite relevant to the application in healthcare, where we're dealing with human lives that are fragile.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in some ways, I think this open question of whether these models are, generalizing beyond its initial domain, it's sort of, not that helpful of a question. In other ways, it's very important. But I think the way that we think about it is that no matter whether it can generalize beyond it, having more training data within the domain that you're working in, and using the same almost like semantics that you're using is very helpful to improve the model, no matter whether or not it can actually generalize. And this is actually why we are very bullish on companies that have some kind of proprietary data, or even better, generating interesting, novel proprietary data, or data that's better capturing kind of the full operations of clinical care better. I think, if you go to a hospital, especially in certain settings, I think everyone knows that, parts of it are captured in administrative data, in clinical records. But I think everyone knows that a lot of both clinical data, clinical discussion, as well as operational data is actually not that well captured in the documentation itself, right? And that actually, I think, does lead to a gap in some of these systems that's trained on AI that isn't able to use some of that data in the understanding of patients in clinical care. So, I mean, we have some other companies too. So another company called General Medicine, founded by former founders of PillPack. They're really thinking about using AI for creating much more accessible care to a lot of Americans by making costs transparent, by having clinical navigation be very, very easy, by having very experienced physician consults be very easy. And I think that's kind of a company where it's still very physician first. At every stage, there's a physician there, but it's really using AI to really think about how do we use that better for patient triage? How do we use that better for scheduling, for making the experience for the patient much better and much clearer while using all the data that you currently have?
I mean, you have some pretty clear problems in healthcare. It takes more than 15 years between the time that an area of medicine actually changes a clinical criteria or pathway and the time it becomes generalized. There are estimates of 500 to 750,000 medical errors every year that are avoidable that happen in the administration. I think it's 20% of all autopsies pick up medical things that might have been that were missed in diagnosis that might have had an impact on patients whether the patients would have lived longer. So this is a target-rich environment for novel interventions. But historically, the promise of technology and data has run well ahead of the success of using that data and changing either the administrative load, to your point, like it's a pain in the butt to make an appointment, see a doctor, even get through the documentation between meetings in a hospital, to real clinical insight in terms of what's new about personalized medicine. Again, promised 20 years ago. You started in this 20 years ago. We're still kind of scratching at whether we can truly personalize drugs and genomics, proteomics, and come up with any insights that will help people live longer. What's different this time? And there's a lot of hype about this. There are a lot of problems to be solved. What's different now that gives you optimism that your investments and the broader investments in AI and data are going to actually improve care or lower costs?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things I'll say about that. The first thing is just that the ROI is definitely there already, right? There's been papers that have shown that, and I know this is sort of a cartoon problem, but it is a real problem where if you just look at differential diagnosis, right, something that physicians do every day. I know it's not the whole job by far, but even if you look at differential diagnosis, there's a bunch of papers out now that essentially show that AI physicians are able to perform at a very, very high level, depending on which paper you read, anywhere between 70th to 90th percentile, right? Of course, again, I'm not saying this is what physicians do all day, but this is getting to the point where, I'll even go ahead and say it. It's starting to get to the point where it's almost going to become, unethical to not at least consult an AI in certain types of diagnoses, right?
That's a big deal. That's saying if you don't use the machine, you're practicing at a suboptimal level, and you're dealing with human life.
Yep, I actually agree with that. Yes, and this is, again, you need to look at it on a case by case basis. For certain specialties, doesn't make sense. For other specialties, 100% makes sense, right? Some other results that are interesting, and because of just how our industry works today, we've had studies having patients rank an AI chatbot versus a physician on a chat about how empathetic they seem. And AI seems to win the vast majority of the time too. And of course, this may be due to physician burnout, due to just, how much time you can actually take to put pen to paper to explain certain things. But I find that really interesting as well. But now, of course, in a real world scenario, we all know that care is much more complex than that. You often at times have a much longer conversation with a physician. You may not want to share everything with a physician. You may even, everyone describes their symptoms incorrectly sometimes, or there's a misunderstanding. Oftentimes there's coordination of care that has to happen. Oftentimes clinical care goes more than just beyond the actual clinical care, right? And in those scenarios, I mean, there's also been studies that show that in a complex care scenario, AIs perform, potentially only slightly better than a physician, or in other cases may even underperform a physician. And I often chalk that up to the fact that a lot of clinical operations are just not digitized right now.
Or maybe there's still a role for some humans.
Oh, that's actually exactly what I mean, right? I think there is a role for humans, but I think that the key we need to think about is how do we capture these operations digitally so that we can either insert humans or insert the best AI, whatever the scenario calls for, right?
And figuring out that dance between the machine and the doctor is going to be interesting. Maybe, Lekan, we could do a lightning round to sort of wrap up. You've done a great job at grounding us in kind of where we're going and what the opportunities are. But I'd like to ask you, sort of from a predictive perspective, I want your predictions on some of the things that people have talked about.
Let's do this.
How soon before we have an AI doc replacing the regular doc?
I think for many Americans now already. And I think if I can just elaborate on this, many people just cannot get access to care, period. And compared to that, pulling up, ChatGPT, or, you should use our company, General Medicine, I think that is already better than not getting care.
How important is it for patients in terms of self-care to use the AI versus trying to find a way to talk to the doctor about how they're going to manage their life?
I think these days this is what I'm actually personally doing. It's about 50-50. I still trust a real world physician. I know there are biases in some of these models and they miss certain things. They have lack of stability sometimes. So I would do 50-50. But so I would use AIs to pull up all your records, make sure that you kind of understand your own condition, but then have the final conversation with a physician.
Great. Drug discovery. The promise of technology, machine learning, AI has been out there, that we're going to be leveraging the machines to finally discover drugs faster, better, smarter. It costs over $1 billion to bring a drug to market. It goes through many of the most novel, the biggest problems, cancer, heart disease, whatever. And and some of those smaller categories where there's a lot of very specific data available, most drugs fail. How long before we can leverage AI to actually materially improve our ability to produce drugs for some of the hardest categories of illness we have?
Yeah, this is a tricky area. I think in the very early stages of just drug discovery for target selection, molecule discovery, that's already happening today, without a doubt. I also do think in later stage, doing feasibility studies on clinical populations and running clinical trials, that's also starting to get better. But I think there's a lot of the middle stages due to a combination of existing processes that are hard as well as regulation. I think in probably 5 to 10 years, we're going to start having a lot more drugs go through this type of AI first drug pipeline.
Awesome. I think we'll leave it there, Lekan. And this has been a wonderful introduction to AI, a tour d'horizon of how it's being used right now. And I really appreciate you joining us. If you liked what you heard or you didn't, we'd love you to subscribe on your favorite service to CareTalk. I'm John Driscoll, the chairman of the UConn Health System. And Lekan, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me, John.